Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today I'm here with Stephen Nemes. Nemes.
Nemes.
Nemes.
Nemes.
Yes, I got it. See, second time, okay? I'm getting better. Stephen is here today to talk about his paper. And is it published yet or is it in the process of being published?
It's under review out there in the world.
Okay, cool. And let me see if I can find the title really quick. The title of the paper is Christianity as Anthropocentric Ontology. So
hmm
Stephen's going to break that down for us, and I'm really excited to see. Just reading the paper, I noticed that there were a lot of bold proposals in there. So I thought, like, wow, okay, Stephen, you're driving it home again. So Stephen, let's just start off since you've been on the show multiple times by just going right into the paper itself. If people don't know you
Okay.
by now, then that's their loss, right? Uh, so
That's
so
kind of you to say.
so what is anthropocentric ontology and what views are you distinguishing this approach from? So I know in the paper you mentioned like nihilism, realism, skepticism. So just unpack for us what's going on in this paper.
Sure. Anthropocentric ontology is the view that the world is entirely intelligible to human beings in principle because it exists for their sake as the arena in which they pursue their goals and purposes and most of all their intrinsic perfection. And this view basically can be summarized by saying that the world is the home of human beings. So when you call something a home, that means that it belongs to somebody. It's ordered towards serving that person's existence and that person's life and so on. Like I have a home because these are where all my possessions are. This is where my food is, my water, my drink, and so on. Uh, Anthropocentric ontology says that the world, everything that exists, is the home of the human being. So it's not that the human being is situated in this greater context, which is in principle indifferent to it. Rather, this greater context exists precisely for the sake of the human being. That's the basic idea of an anthropocentric ontology. Anthropocentric ontology is distinguished from what I call realism. So realism says that the world exists in itself, right, independently of human beings. The world has an existence of its own, independently of the existence of human beings, which means that it may or may not be intelligible to human beings, whether at all or entirely. And for that reason, also, it may or may not secure the possibility of a meaningful existence for human beings, whether entirely or at all. So anthropocentric ontology is intended as an alternative to realism. Realism says that this world, this greater context in which we find ourselves, has an existence of its own, independently of the existence of human beings. And for that reason, its relation to human beings on the epistemic and ethic planes is a problem, right? It could be that the world is not knowable to us, whether at all or in part. And it could be that the world is not friendly to us in terms of making possible a meaningful existence for us, whether at all, whether entirely or in part. That's what realism says. Anthropocentric ontology says no, the world is the home of the human being. It exists for the sake of the human being. It's the arena in which the human being is to pursue its own perfection. And for that reason, also, it's entirely intelligible to the human being in principle. Now, that doesn't mean that it's entirely intelligible to any one person in particular, but basically the idea is that there's nothing out there, there's no truth out there in the world that could not in principle be known by a human being. So that's the basic idea of anthropocentric ontology and how it is distinguished from realism. I can't hear you, by
Whoops.
the way.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I muted my mic. I wanted to say, if we can just unpack some things that you've said so far. Okay, so usually like among Thomists and just other theists, like realism seems to be what they really want, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you're saying that there's something better. So let me propose like a definition of realism that I've come across and see whether
Sure.
or not you think it is compatible with what you presented or what critiques you'd have. So, in Rob Koons's book, Realism Regained, he presents like three conditions for realism. So I think the conditions are that, there are propositions about the world that can be assigned true, false values. And the true or false values are determined or shaped rather by certain causal facts about the world, right? So if it's the case that X, let's say, then whatever X is, it's going to be actually shaped by the causal structure of the world. So something's going to make it the case. And, there's something like, I think, mind independence there and so on and so forth. And maybe that's the key condition you might kind of want to explore. But I mean, what do you think about that definition of realism? Do you feel like it doesn't go far enough into what you believe it should say, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, basically, I would inquire into the condition of mind independence. All right.
Sure.
So this relation that obtains between the world and true propositions. Um, to what extent is that mind independent? Is it independent even of God's mind? In which case, we are, have a theism, or we distinguish between realism and theism. If there's also this question about truth being this relation between a proposition and a state of affairs or whatever, a concrete reality. I think that's not exactly the notion of truth that I would go for, because I think that truth is something that is grasped. It's not this relation that exists ahead of time, because I don't think propositions exist, independently. What do I think a proposition is? I think a proposition is at best a judgment formed about some reality that is proposed to somebody else in conversation. So if I say to you, for example, that that it's sunny outside, that's a proposition, but it's not as if that proposition is like some independent thing out there. It's just something that I've said. It's a way that I've described the world, and you can see the truth of that proposition when you compare what I say to the things that I'm talking about, right? If you look outside and you see if it is or it is not sunny. So I don't like this notion of a proposition as like this thing out there that exists independently of anybody talking, independently of anybody thinking, and it has a relation to the world. I don't buy that. So I don't think there is any such thing. I also don't agree that the world exists independently of anybody thinking or anybody talking. It may exist independently of any one of us thinking or talking, but I don't agree that the world exists independently of God. So at the very least, I would say that the world bears a dependency relation to God, which maybe undermines the mind independence, thing that realism is often associated with.
Yeah, that's a great point. And let's see here. The second question I wanted to ask was, so you argued that in principle, right, all of reality is intelligible, and I think that's like I mean, personally for me, that's a very reasonable position, because if it's not, then oh man, you can just collapse the whole thing. At least that's how it seems to me, right? So suppose somebody says, well, Stephen, you say that it should be in principle, reasonable, right? But, I don't know, some people might say reality doesn't have to be in principle reasonable to you, or maybe they might say, but think about how difficult quantum theory is, or how difficult it is to understand reality. Doesn't that count as evidence against all of reality in principle being intelligible? What would you say in response?
Well, what I would say in response is that this objection takes for granted that the world has a measure of existence independently of our thinking about it or being conscious of it. And then the question would be, okay, what reason do you have for thinking that? What reason can you have for thinking that the world exists independently of our being aware of it? Now, maybe it exists independently of my being aware of it and yours and anyone in particular, but why do you think that the world exists independently of awareness in principle, just in general? We'll talk more about this later, but my argument, and here's where I draw from Bishop George Berkeley, my argument is going to be that that's a thesis that you cannot have any reason to believe and you could not know in principle. So it's this unknowable, unjustifiable principle, or proposition that raises problems in our epistemology, and we would do better without it. Now, how does it raise problems with our epistemology? Because look at what you've said. Reality does not have to be knowable to us. Okay, well then that means that we have to distinguish, at least in principle, what we know and the reality. And then we're left with the question, do we know anything of reality, or do we only have access to, representations of our consciousness or whatever? If you go down that road, you will run into trouble. If you distinguish what we know from the reality, then you will eventually ask the question, well, how do you know that you know any reality at all? But if you ask that further question, you say, why do you think that? Then we can also ask why I think that there is a reality beyond what we know. So you're stuck back in my position if you go this route. If you distinguish between reality and what we know, then eventually you ask the question, how do we know that we have access to reality at all? How do we know that there is a reality at all beyond what we know? And so we're back in my position where reality is what we know. So it seems to me that, like, by contesting this position, by contesting this identification between reality and intelligibility or knowability, you just lead back to it eventually.
Yeah, and the position that you raised, it reminds me of a lot of of idealism, and especially people like Michael Jones on his channel when he talks about, I think, like the cosmic consciousness argument, right? Um, where basically reality doesn't exist independently of minds, right? So there has to be this
Mhm.
one mind that keeps everything intact or whatever, so to speak, and that's kind of his
Sure.
argument. But I mean, would you be okay being labeled as an idealist, or what are your thoughts on that?
I think that anthropocentric ontology is a version of idealism.
Hmm.
Now, I don't want to commit myself. I mean, there are different varieties of idealism, and there are different ways of understanding the claims of idealism. My own path into idealism went the way of phenomenology,
Hmm.
and I perhaps give different kinds of arguments than maybe analytic idealists would give. Um, I also would say that my own version of anthropocentric ontology, basically, I argued that, in my paper, I mentioned three different thinkers from Christian history who put forth something that sounds like an anthropocentric ontology, namely Berkeley, Dumitru Staniloae, the Romanian Orthodox theologian, and Michel Henry, the French phenomenologist. I think that you find idealism basically in all of their philosophies, although in the case of Staniloae and in the case of Henri, this is controversial because, people sort of people don't like the label idealism. They don't like the
Mm.
idea that, they sort of like maybe don't have a total grasp of what idealism is saying. They think that if idealism is true, then this whole world is just a dream,
Right.
or, the things that I'm experiencing have no more reality than the things that I imagine or fantasize about, as I'm dreaming or whatever. So I would say that anthropocentric ontology is a version of idealism, but people can get confused about what idealism is, and they're thrown off by the label. They're more scared of the word than what is actually being said. So I don't necessarily like call it a version of idealism per se. I would sooner call it an anthropocentric ontology, because that turn of phrase is a little more neutral, and it doesn't have the scary connotations of idealism, per se.
Yeah. And okay, so now moving on to kind of another question on the docket. What would your position have to say about naturalism, since that seems to be kind of the hot thing on the press right now, so to speak?
Yes. So naturalism, as far as I take it in its sort of ontological, version, basically begins from, it's what I call a philosophy of objectivity. Okay, so in all of our experiences, we have sort of two poles. There's the object pole and the subject pole. I see you, for example, you're an object to me. You're out there in the world, and through experience, I become conscious of you. So I am a subject that can become conscious of you as an object. Now, every philosophy, to some extent, not quite every philosophy, but most philosophies privilege one or the other, poles of experience. Either the object pole is most fundamental, or else the subject pole is most fundamental. Either the fundamental reality is an object or a subject. And naturalism is a philosophy of objectivity. Naturalism says that the most fundamental realities are objects. They're objective beings out there in the world, right? And the relation to a subject in consciousness only arises later. So if you read Graham Oppy, for example, he will say that part of the teaching of naturalism is that consciousness, or minded entities, as he calls them, only arose relatively recently in the history of the universe, right? There was not consciousness at the beginning. There was just objects in space and time, interacting in their own ways. So naturalism is a philosophy of objectivity that says that the object pole of experience has existence in itself. And the relation to a subject, in consciousness only arises later as a result of the contingent and accidental, configurations of objects. So if, the atoms in the universe had not moved in the way that they did, maybe no consciousness ever would have emerged, right? That's what I mean when I say that the relation to a subject arises only as a result of the contingent, combination of or configuration of objects. So naturalism is at base a philosophy of objectivity. It's a kind of a realist philosophy of objectivity in some versions, because it says that the world exists independently of consciousness, right? Consciousness arose only much later as a result of the accidental configuration of parts of this world. Well, my argument against naturalism would be that it has this basically it's an argument against objectivity, philosophies of objectivity altogether. There is no basis for thinking that the object can exist apart from its relation to any subject whatsoever. This is Berkeley's master argument, right? What we have in experience is an object. It's something that shows itself to consciousness. But then the question arises, okay, is this something more than just a showing or an appearing? The naturalist and the philosopher of objectivity in general takes it for granted that first the thing exists on its own and then it shows itself, right? Because otherwise, if it didn't exist on its own, how could I see it? But this is where I'm going to argue. Okay, you say that first it exists on its own and then it shows itself to you in experience. I grant that you can say that it shows itself to you in experience because obviously you're experiencing it. But how do you know that it exists on its own? How can you possibly know that? I'm going to argue that you cannot, in principle, know that. And here's my argument. Basically, knowledge in the phenomenological tradition that I am a part of, or at least I try to be a part of, knowledge is we could say knowledge is seeing that. So, for example, if I am to know that you have books on your bookshelf, I have to be able to see that you have books on your bookshelf. Knowledge is sort of seeing that. It's having something there in front of you. And this thing appears clearly enough that you can judge it to be a certain way. Now, that doesn't only mean seeing with your eyes, right? I can see that 2 + 2 = 4. Phenomenologically interpreted, how do I know that 2 + 2 = 4? It's because I have these realities, the number 2, addition, the number 4, the notion of equality, and so on. I have these realities present to my mind in sufficient clarity so that I can see that 2 + 2 = 4 is true. So phenomenologically interpreted, knowledge is seeing that, right? Or understanding that something is the case. So if I'm going to know that you have books on your bookshelf, I have to be able to see that you have books on your bookshelf. That's the phenomenological point. Or at the very least, you have to be able to see it and you can tell me about it, right? So either I can see something or somebody else can see it and tells me about it. If you want to know how much I can lift, for example, let's, suppose I tell you that I can lift a certain weight. In order to know that, you must either see me lifting it or else hear from somebody else, right, who saw it. So then let's ask the question, okay, how could we know that objects of consciousness exist independently of any consciousness whatsoever? Objects of consciousness exist independently of their being related to any consciousness whatsoever. How could you know that? Well, following this line of reasoning, you would either have to see an object existing independently of any consciousness whatsoever, or else hear from somebody else about it. But obviously that's impossible because you cannot see something and it's at the same time being independently of any consciousness, because then it's present to your consciousness, right? And neither could you hear from somebody else that, an object exists independently of any consciousness, because that person at least has to be in the position to see it existing without any consciousness, which is contradictory. So this is the basic thrust of the argument. Naturalism posits something. It says that the world first exists out there on its own as pure objectivity, and subjectivity, consciousness, only arises later. I am going to say that is a premise, that is a thesis that you do not have any reason to believe, and neither could you in principle know it. This is something that is intrinsically unknowable, okay? So naturalism as a philosophy makes assertions that are unknowable and that it cannot justify in principle. Now, what's the difficulty here is that this way of thinking is actually pretty natural. We just assume that, something is first out there and then it becomes related to us in consciousness. But this is confusion. It's true that everything is out there independently of me, but it doesn't follow that everything is out there independently of any consciousness whatsoever. Okay, so I am confusing the independence of the world relative to me with its independence relative to any consciousness whatsoever. And that is a confusion that, we have to clarify. So my principal argument against naturalism would be that it's a philosophy of objectivity. It's a form of realism. And realism, the basic, presumption of realism being the existence in itself of the object, realism is philosophically unjustifiable. You cannot give a reason in principle. You could not have a reason, neither could you know that what realism says is true, right? So the advantage of an anthropocentric ontology as a version of idealism, if you want to call it that, is that it doesn't go beyond what's given. It doesn't make more claims about things than what we can justify, right? It limits itself to what is actually the data of experience. And so for that reason, it's superior to naturalism. But notice, this is where naturalism gets its force. So I think all the force of naturalism in the apologetic debates and the Christianity debates on the internet arises from the fact that it starts with objectivity and then it understands subjectivity as something that has to come later, right? Everybody just sort of takes this for granted. If you just take, atoms and you put them in the right arrangement, then you'll get a brain, and then the brain is conscious, okay? So people just assume that subjectivity somehow emerges or arises out of, objects being arranged in the right way. Well, my point is going to be, no, this is entirely backwards. You do not know in the first place that anything can exist independently of subjectivity. And in the second place, you do not get subjectivity just by adding things up together, right? You cannot add things up together. Things are just those things that you're adding together, those molecules, atoms, whatever you want to call them. They're merely appearances. They're just things that appear, right? So already they imply a relation to consciousness. And so, this is sort of like the apologetic significance of anthropocentric ontology. Naturalism is a form of realism. And of course, unfortunately, Christians, for the most part, want to be realists. And so they are giving the naturalist unnecessary, sort of advantage. They're playing on the naturalist's home turf by assuming this philosophy of objectivity, when my suggestion is, in fact, that Christianity is not a philosophy of objectivity at all. It's an anthropocentric ontology, and so therefore switches things around entirely compared to naturalism.
Right. So since the naturalist already doesn't believe that there's a God, and they only view consciousness as a phenomenon of, us Homo sapiens, and we have only been around since maybe the last 100,000 years, then obviously in the history of the world, consciousness is, so to speak, just an afterthought, pun intended.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, that's good. So then moving on to my next question then, in your paper, you also say that anthropocentric ontology is the fulfillment of philosophy. And I thought that was a really fascinating claim. So, can you unpack, what does it mean for anthropocentric ontology to be the fulfillment of philosophy, and why do you say that?
Sure. I take it that the goal of philosophy is to make things clear. What we are trying to do in philosophy is to clarify things that appear in our experience. And we try to clarify things by engaging in hermeneutics, by interpreting them, right? I say this thing means X, right? And then I see if this ascription of meaning to the thing in question helps me to understand it better. So for example, if I'm reading, we can take the easy example of a text. If I'm reading, Galatians or Romans, and I want to understand what Paul is talking about, I have to assume that when he uses the word pistis or faith, he means something, okay? So I fill in the blanks. I say, okay, let's suppose that faith means blah, blah, blah. Then I see whether this ascription of meaning helps me to make sense of what Paul is saying and makes it intelligible. And if it doesn't, if I find that, understanding faith in this way sort of produces tensions in what Paul is saying, then maybe I should understand faith differently. Maybe I have to give a different meaning to that term and then check and see if that second ascribed meaning helps me to understand better what Paul is saying. Well, I'm going to say that philosophy is just doing that, but with everything, not just with texts, with the world, right? How does it help me, suppose, to understand you? If I say that you are if I suppose a sort of a hylomorphic dualist account, right? Does talking about you as a form matter composite help me to understand better what you are, right? So first I'll start with the assumption, okay, Swan is a form matter composite, and then I will see if that way of thinking or talking about you actually helps me to make sense of what you are. And if it doesn't, then perhaps I can offer a different view, maybe a reductive materialist view, or a substance dualist view, or an idealist view, or whatever. But basically, all of philosophy is about interpreting. Philosophy is about saying what things are and then seeing if talking about them in that way helps us to understand what they are better. So I understand philosophy as a form of interpretation. Now, the most basic aspect to be interpreted is the relation between what I am and what everything else is. Right? Everything else that is not me, that is related to me somehow in experience, and what I am. This is the basic level of interpretation, the world and the self, because everything else takes place within this framework. Everything else is just some more particular instance of a relation between myself and something that is not me. And so the question arises, okay, how to understand this relationship? What can I say about the world and the self so that I can try to bring this, reality or this relation into maximal light so that I can make it clear and intelligible to me in principle? For example, I can say, like David Hume, that there is no self. There is just a world, right? There is just this flash of experiences and impressions and so on, and there is no self to whom they all belong. That's one possible interpretation. But I think that it's phenomenologically undermined because I think that we have an immediate awareness of ourselves as selves, right? It's true that the self is never at the object pole of an experience. I never experience myself as an object. I only ever experience myself sort of immediately as myself, as a you know, as the subject of all my experiences. But that doesn't mean that because I'm not an object, I don't exist, right? So I think that's where David Hume's mistake is made. He assumes that because there is no experience of the self as an object, therefore there's no self. He's just assuming there are only objects, right? David Hume, in his form of empiricism, is another philosopher of objectivity, although it may sound strange to say. So the problem with David Hume is that he assumes that the self doesn't exist because it's not an object. Now, I agree that it's not an object, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist because it's given. I'm experiencing myself now. So David Hume's philosophy is a philosophy. It's an interpretation of this self-world relation. It says the self doesn't exist. There is only the world. But it's problematic. It doesn't actually help us to understand things because it misses something. My own experience of myself goes missing in David Hume's analysis. Naturalism says that the world exists independently of its relation to any self. First, there's a world, it's out there, right? And only later, as a result of evolution, are there selves, are there conscious subjects that arise, as a result of the contingent combination of material bodies. This is an interpretation of the self-world relation. It says that the self arises within the world, right? As a contingent matter of fact. The world existed on its own. The self did not have to arise at all. It could have been that there was no self. Maybe evolution never took a turn in such a way as to lead to the development of consciousness or whatever. So this is an interpretation of the self-whole relation. But the problem is this. Okay, this interpretation makes a claim that cannot be verified. It says that the world exists independently of consciousness, and that's how it interprets the relation between the self and the world. It says that the world exists independently of the self and of any self whatsoever. But that's a claim that you can't verify. It's a claim that remains unknowable, right? The ideal of an interpretation is an interpretation that is self-verifying. I say only what is necessary to make sense of the reality, and everything that I say can be confirmed. That's the ideal of an interpretation. Naturalism goes beyond that. It makes a claim about the independent existence in itself of the world that cannot be verified, even in principle. And so that's why it's bad as an interpretation. It interprets everything in light of a claim that it cannot prove. Anthropocentric ontology is the fulfillment of philosophy because it interprets this self-world relation in such a way that everything that it says can be verified. It says that the world exists for me and that's why I have it. Now, how do you verify this? Well, I have access to the world, don't I? So it's for me. It's accessible to me. There is nothing more to say beyond it except that it's accessible to me, that I can make use of it for my own goals and purposes, as obviously I can, since we're talking over Zoom, right? The laptop, the Zoom, the microphone, all these things are human appropriations of the materials of the world for our own purposes, right? So anthropocentric ontology basically is the fulfillment of philosophy because it only interprets the world with reference to things that human beings can know and experience. It provides a maximally clarifying, maximally intelligible interpretation of the self-world relation because it basically limits what it says to what human beings already know and can do. It says there is nothing more to the world beyond, what the perspective of human life can afford us or can give us access to. And that's why it does the job. That's why it does the trick. It brings the world into the sphere of human intelligibility rather than, situating the world out there and trying to find a place for us within it. So that's why I think that anthropocentric ontology is the fulfillment of philosophy, because it provides an interpretation of things which brings maximal light, right? The world is nothing more except what is knowable and what is available to the human perspective. That's all there is to the world. And so once I say that, the world is intelligible in principle because I'm not positing anything beyond what is knowable to us. And for that reason also, I'm providing an interpretation of the world that is maximally clarifying, right? I've limited the world to what is knowable to us. And so for that reason, I provided an interpretation where everything else that I say can be in principle verified on the basis of an experience. So that's what I mean when I say that anthropocentric ontology is the fulfillment of philosophy. It provides an interpretation of the world such that, it does not make claims that cannot be verified or cannot be justified experientially or argumentatively or whatever. That's what I mean when I say that.
So to use language that you kind of hate, right? It's more kind of theoretically virtuous, right? It doesn't posit more unnecessary, claims about reality that can't be verified or confirmed by immediate experience or even what's within the scope of our reason, right?
Correct. Anthropocentric ontology is theoretically virtuous, in comparison to naturalism and every other form of realism or philosophy of objectivity. Correct.
Nice. Okay, so I'm going to start narrowing down our discussion to 3 more questions, right? So the first question is, are there any further arguments that you'd want to give for this position, or do you feel like you've kind of laid out the buffet, so to speak?
So in my paper, I talk about 3 thinkers, like I mentioned, who put forth an anthropocentric ontology. Dimitros Staniloae, Michel Henry, and then Bishop George Berkeley, whom we've already discussed earlier, his master argument, or at least my interpretation of his master argument. But I also make the argument in my paper that realism inevitably leads to skepticism or nihilism. So this is like, instead of the positive argument in favor of anthropocentric ontology, here's an argument against realism. Now, how is it? Because that sounds strange, right? How is it that realism leads to nihilism or skepticism? Well, basically, it depends, right? So first of all, we admit the human experience of the world is an interpreted experience of the world, right? We see the world through the filter of our body. Various things are visible or invisible to us because of the sort of body that we have. We are capable of recognizing medium-sized objects because we are ourselves medium-sized. If we were like extremely large or extremely small, we would never recognize the existence of cats or anything else. So even our access to the world is mediated through what our body makes possible for us. And furthermore, our access to the world is made possible through our thought life, what I call our thought life, our way of thinking and our way of interpreting things. The experience of the world is different depending on how you think about things. This was the principle of Stoic philosophy, right? You only suffer in your life because you think that things are happening to you that are bad, which in fact are not. If you learn how to, abstain from making judgments of badness, then you don't suffer. That's the basic principle of Stoic philosophy. And it's, to some extent, it's obvious, right? I mean, imagine somebody who finds out that he's adopted. Okay, he experiences his parents differently after learning that. Maybe it's not necessarily bad. He doesn't necessarily hate them or whatever, but certainly they feel differently to him. Now, why is it that they feel differently to him? Have they changed? No. Has he had a change in his body? Have his sensory organs somehow been changed by this revelation? No. What happened is he thinks about them differently. And so because he thinks about them differently, he no longer thinks of them as his biological parents, but as his adopted parents. For that reason, he also experiences them differently. So the way we experience the world is mediated in these 2 ways. In the first place, by our body, and in the second place, by the way that we think. Our experience of the world would be different if we had a different sort of body or if we thought differently about things. So here's the problem. Okay, so human experience of the world is, you might call hermeneutical. It's interpreted, it's mediated. So then the question is, all right, we say that the world exists independently of human beings. It does not have an essential connection to human beings. It has existence on its own, and only later is it put in relation to human beings. Well, this relation is mediated hermeneutically through the body and through the thought life. So then the question arises, do we have access to the world as it is in itself? Does the mediated hermeneutical experience of the world from the human perspective yield a contact with the world as it is in itself? If you say no, then skepticism follows, because we can never know whether our experience of the world actually matches with what the world is. Right? Everything that we only have access to, our experience of the world. We only have access to the way that our constitution makes the world available for us. And we cannot step outside of it. I cannot stop being a human being and experiencing the world differently than I am, right? Every experience that I have is a human experience. So if I don't know that the world is as it is to humans, then I don't know whether I know anything at all. All that I have access to is this world that I experience, the human world, right? And the real world beyond the human world, who knows what that is? So that's why there's skepticism, right? And then you also run into the problem of why even posit a world beyond the human world. So again, there's this instability, right? Realism combined with a recognition of the hermeneutical nature of experience leads to this theoretical instability where I either don't know anything about the world at all, and then, or even I lose, reason for positing that there is a world beyond what I experience. So that's one problem. Realism leads to skepticism if you admit the inevitably hermeneutical nature of the experience of the world. On the other hand, if you say that, yes, we can, access the truth of reality in itself, say, for example, through the sciences, right? This is the argument of the continental philosophers Ray Brassier and Quentin Meillassoux. They say, yes, in science, through the scientific method, we can grasp the mathematically quantifiable properties of the world, and these exist independently of any consciousness whatsoever. So Quentin Meillassoux, for example, gives the argument that contemporary science reveals that the world has existed, or the universe has existed for roughly 14 billion years. It's been around for a lot longer than any life has been around. And so for that reason, we can know what the real truth of things is, right? The real truth of things is just this quantifiable, collection of primary qualities of things that can be mathematically known and, used for various, to predict or to understand the beginning of the world. But then with Ray Brassier, we also learned that the end of the world can be predictable. So not only is the beginning of the universe, knowable, but the end of the universe is also knowable. And this is a major crisis for some theologians. John Polkinghorne, for example, and Robert Welker and others write about this issue. The end of the universe can be mathematically predicted. And so Ray Brassier takes this as grounds for saying that therefore nihilism follows, right? The end of everything is extinction. This is something that we do know what the world is like in itself, and we know that it's not our home. It doesn't care for us, right? Its final destination is a place where we're not welcome. We're going to die, and that's just the way things are. So notice what has happened. In both cases, the world has been defined independently of human beings, right? It's been defined in itself, independently of its connection to human beings. And so if you admit that the human experience of the world is inevitably mediated and hermeneutical, and we don't have access to the things in themselves, and that leads to skepticism. If you say that we do have access to the things themselves, but this world exists on its own, independently of human beings, well, then you find out that the world doesn't seem to care very much for us. It's going to die, and it's going to take us with it, or rather, it's going to kill us long before that ever happens. So you either have skepticism or nihilism if you have realism, right? And the problem is always from the beginning. The problem is that the world has been defined independently of human beings. The world from the beginning has been said to exist on its own with no reference to human beings at all. And so then the problem arises, human beings are on the scene. How do we relate to this world? Well, we have to try to find a way of making a place for ourselves here while it lasts, because otherwise, we're going to die. And even if we do make a place for ourselves, it's not going to be a permanent one, because this universe is toast in the end, right? It's going to disappear. It'll be annihilated. So this is why realism leads to skepticism or nihilism. If you admit that the human experience of the world is necessarily interpreted and mediated, then you lead to skepticism, because you can't get outside of that interpreted experience to see its adequacy to its object. All we have is, the representation that the human perspective affords us. If you admit that we do have access to the world in itself through science, well, science predicts that the world basically is going to die in 10, decillion years or however many years, and human beings are going to find themselves in an uninhabitable universe long before that, right? So again, human existence would seem to be meaningless. It's just this, a blip, this tiny moment in the whole history of a universe that does not care about human beings at all and seems to get along just fine without them, and will eventually itself die. So that's why that's the argument against realism. Realism leads to skepticism or nihilism. Anthropocentric ontology avoids both of these problems precisely because it's not realist, precisely because the world is not defined independently of human beings, but defined specifically with relation to them. So for the anthropocentric ontologist, it's not merely that the human perspective is one more perspective among others, right? The human perspective is that perspective within which all others have to be included. There is nothing beyond what can be known from the human perspective, because the world, again, exists for human beings. That's why it's there. It's for us. And so it's entirely knowable to us in principle. And furthermore, on an anthropocentric ontology, the scientific description of the world is not the ultimate description of things. That does not give you the truth of the matter. That does not, right? Because again, anthropocentric ontology is not a philosophy of objectivity. And so it does not accord fundamental ontological significance to the object. All right. The truth of the world is that it exists for the sake of human beings. So if right now it doesn't seem to be very inhabitable, then it will become so later. Or perhaps in its very uninhabitability, there is a challenge to us, right? Anthropocentric ontology doesn't say that everything has to be easy for us, but it does say that everything is here for us. So it could be that things are difficult because we have to challenge ourselves. We have to take up the challenge of this life, and to try to make a place for ourselves in spite of the difficulties. So I also think that a lot of the the classic Christian responses to the problem of evil, like the soul building, the soul making theodicy, and so on, these only make sense within an anthropocentric ontology. Only a human being can build his soul, right? Animals do not become better by struggling with evil. Maybe Richard Swinburne, I think, has some lines about this here and there, but I don't think it makes much sense. A human being becomes better by struggling with evil. And the only way that it would make sense for human beings to be put in this world, this vale of tears, is because it's a part of the way that we reach our perfection, is that we struggle with evil and we fight against it, right? And we deal with the difficulties of life head on. So the soul-making theodicy is part and parcel of anthropocentric ontology. Why is it that things are not easy for us if everything was created for us? Well, because we are made better by struggling. We are made better by facing difficulties head on and solving problems and encountering evils and conquering them. That's a part of the way that we are perfected, and it's something that's possible for us, which is not possible for any other creature, as that we know of. So this is how I would say that anthropocentric ontology avoids these problems. It avoids skepticism because it does not make the human perspective merely one more perspective among others, and it avoids nihilism because it says that the scientific description of the world is not the only, or nor even the ultimate description of things. If the world, is not presently friendly for us, well, we can make it friendly for us because it is knowable. And if the world in its current state does not seem to be a final destination for human beings, that's because the world will be restored, or it'll be changed, or maybe there'll be a new world. It doesn't matter. But the world does not exist on its own, right? The world exists for us. And so if this world is not presently a final destination for us, then there will be another one which is. And this is, of course, to make a reference, a sort of a subtle reference to the argument from desire that C.S. Lewis and others have also given. So this is what I would say, right? The problems of realism, skepticism, and nihilism are avoided by Christianity precisely because it's not a realism, precisely because it's an anthropocentric ontology. And that's where the advantage comes from.
Okay, so let me just start wrapping up by maybe asking two more questions. So on one hand, and this is kind of going off the docket, right? But on one hand, since you already hit some of the other points, unless you want to go deeper into Christianity, right? But right now, one question that I have is, suppose a theistic realist, right, says, well, yeah, I mean, what you said is true. We know how the universe is going to die, on the assumption that God does not intervene, right? But if you're a theistic realist, then you can say, okay, but we know that God's going to intervene, and therefore we're not destined towards nihilism, right? So maybe that's one way that a realist can avoid nihilism if he or she is a theist. And then let me first get your response to that, then I'll ask the second question that was on my mind.
So this is basically the response that I make in a paper that is forthcoming in Theology and Science. So I've actually written on this issue of the doom of the universe, the eventual demise of the universe, and classical theism, and so on. I agree. Christianity says that God will transform the world, and that in its current state, it will not simply remain in its current state; it will be transformed. So I agree with all that. I think that's perfectly fine. I would just say, why do you care to call yourself a realist? Right? It's not as if realism gets you there. Christianity gets you there. Right? So realism does not get you to the premise that the world will be transformed. Christianity does. So, I suppose in that case, there is nothing unique about the realist. The
So
realist
it's just
can't
like,
say that, but not as a realist.
right. So you're saying like, as a realist, you kind of have to slap on theism, right? Whereas in your position,
Right.
with anthropocentric ontology, it's part of the whole package, so to speak, already.
Correct. Right.
All right.
So basically, the claim is that this notion about the restoration of the world and its transformation and so on, this is a claim that Christianity makes and not a claim that realism makes. Right. So the realist can certainly say that, but they're not saying it as a realist.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, so here's kind of my last question, and then I'll allow you, after I ask this question, to kind of dive deeper into any topic that you wanted to cover with respect to your paper. So I've seen some naturalists say, well, okay, look, we know that anthropocentric ontology says the universe or the cosmos was made for us, but I mean, think about how small the planet Earth is compared to the stars in the universe, or the sun, or the solar system, or the trillions of galaxies that exist. Think about how human beings have only been on the Earth for 100,000 years with respect to the 14 billion year history of the world. And obviously, like, if history manifested itself like the book of Genesis, literally, so to speak, 6,000 years ago, we had Adam and Eve and everything at the beginning, then yeah, maybe we can see, oh yeah, anthropocentric ontology, that seems to be anticipated, right? But the naturalist might say the world just exactly has the properties that we would expect if we didn't matter, if we were just another animal among animals, and we're just drifting away from existence one day. What would you say?
The problem with this, yeah, so the problem with this line of reasoning is that it tries to find the meaningfulness of human existence with reference to the world, rather than trying to find the meaningfulness of the world with reference to human existence, right? So it says, listen, the world has been around for 14 billion years. There's only one planet, as far as we know, where there's life, right? So just a bunch of world facts, a bunch of world facts. And even then, life is only maybe a couple, however many, I don't even know how many, if there's been a billion years or something. I don't know the evolutionary timeline. Maybe for 100 or something years, 100,000 years, there have been human beings or whatever, something close enough to human beings. Why would you think that all of this was created for them, right? You're just listing off a bunch of these objective facts, right? Again, naturalism begins with philosophy of objectivity. It cannot think any other way. It's just people who are obsessed with objects. And they say, well, look at these facts. Why would you say that the world exists for us, right? If you give all these mathematical facts. My whole point is, listen, this is not the ultimate level of description. Here is a world where I can make use of all these things that I have at my disposal and accomplish my own goals. I can talk to Swan, who lives thousands of miles away from me, using the materials of this world, and I can, realize an actual encounter between two human persons and develop a friendship over thousands of miles just using the materials of this world. Look at how this world, I can use it for my own purposes and can do things that this world on its own cannot do, right? This world exists for me. Who cares that as far as the world knows, I might as well not exist? That's not the point. This world exists for me because, look, I can make use of it. It makes sense to me. I can know it. And even if there are things which are not obviously useful to me now, they can become so later, right? Imagine people, I'm just watching this TV series now with my wife, Outlander, about this woman who goes back in time 200 years, right? And she falls in love with this Scotsman from 200 years ago, and they get married. And eventually in the show, they move to America. Okay. And she's a doctor. She was trained, in the early 1900s, in the time of the Second World War. She was trained as a doctor, or as a nurse rather. And she goes back in time and she becomes a healer. So she knows how to heal people. She performs surgery on things where people back in that time would have just like blown smoke, there was this really funny episode where she performed surgery on a man who has a hernia. And a doctor from that time comes in and he said, "You've butchered him. All he needed was some smoke up the anus. He didn't need to be operated on." Of course, she knows better, right? She knows better that a hernia can kill him and that she needed to operate on him. So she goes back in time, and what she does seems ridiculous to the people who are there. Now, here's another interesting scene. She knows that she can save a lot of lives by having penicillin, but it hasn't been invented yet for at least 150 years or so. So she, bakes a bunch of bread, and she puts slices, pieces of bread under glass, and she lets the bread go moldy in the hopes of being able to create penicillin herself. Now, the people there don't understand what she's doing. They cannot understand how you can get from bread mold something that can save a person's life, right? But she later on knows the usefulness of this natural material for her purposes. Okay, so suppose you just list, as a good naturalist will do, just list a bunch of facts about the age of the universe and its seeming apparent indifference to life and so on. Okay, it's obvious that I can make use of the Earth's materials for my own purposes, and I can do things and accomplish realities as a human being that nothing else on Earth can do, right? I can make use of this Earth for my own purposes. Now, you list a bunch of things in front of me that seem to have no significance for me. That's fine, but from the fact that they have no significance for me now, it doesn't mean that they will never become significant later on. Everything about the universe, according to anthropocentric ontology, is a possible means for the perfection of the human being. And so why is the universe so old? I don't know. Maybe we don't care much about that now, but later on, perhaps the very age of the universe will become a factor that we can use in the pursuit of our goals. Why is it that there's only life on one planet right now? I don't know, but it could be that later on, this fact also will become useful for us, right, in the further pursuit of our goals. So from the mere fact that there are a lot of things about the universe that don't presently seem useful, it doesn't follow that they are not useful in principle, right? And I will leave to the side the argument that I gave earlier that in the first place, the naturalist cannot even justify his own conviction that the universe exists independently of any consciousness, right? So I'll leave that to the side. I will simply address this fact. Everything that is there in the universe is a possible object for human use. From the fact that it's not obviously useful now, it doesn't follow that it never will be, and I would use the example from Outlander as a way of illustrating the point.
All right, with that, Stephen, I just want to ask you, is there anything else that you want to talk about with respect to your paper, or do you feel like you're satisfied with everything that you presented so far?
I think the presentation has been pretty good. I would say that, so here's just a final shout out for the people who like apologetics. I think presuppositionalist apologetics would do itself favors if it began arguing for the necessity of an anthropocentric ontology, rather than saying that unless you presuppose the Bible as the word of God, then you can't make sense of your worldview. I think the stronger argument is actually that an anthropocentric ontology is the only way of avoiding nihilism and skepticism, right? So the presuppositionalists should abandon realism. They should abandon this obsession with presupposing everything in the Bible. They should abandon all that. However, what they can do is offer a kind of a transcendental argument for anthropocentric ontology, right? Unless you say that the world was created and exists for human beings, then there is no escaping nihilism and skepticism. There's no making sense of how it is that we can know the world, and there is no making sense of the possibility of a meaningful human life. So that would be a sort of an anthropocentric, argument, an anthropocentric apologetic, which might be seen in certain ways to resemble presuppositionalist apologetics.
All right, Stephen Namesh, right? Coming in defense of fundamentalists and presuppositional apologetics. No, I was kidding.
Exactly.
Yes.
Somebody's got to defend them. They get beat up too often. Somebody has to come to their aid.
All right. Well, Stephen, thank you for your act of charity towards the presuppositionalist community. And yeah, Stephen, thank you for spending the time talking to me about this episode. So we have another episode that we hope to get into very soon. But I think right now this is a good wrap up. What do you think?
I think so too. Thank you for having me on.